Okay. How you doing? You doing okay today?
Yeah, I had to slot a little call in right before this one,
Okay, good.
and so I've been engaged already,
Good.
but that's good. I don't feel too tired yet, and I've actually scheduled the day so it's got a nice pace to it. How about yourself?
Good. Yeah, I haven't had a call yet. This is the first one. Lucky first one. But yeah, just waking up here. Um, where are you at? I'm in Long Beach.
I'm in Cardiff. Do you know that town?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I don't know the town, but I think I know where it is. Yeah.
Yeah, just south
So
of Encinitas.
yeah, yeah. All right, California Day.
Yeah.
All right, where should we start? Um, Yeah, I have a lot to ask you about, a lot that I'd like to talk to you about. I've just been so happy to see you and John and Greg and Zach and these kinds of people on YouTube doing something really different and sort of, yeah, introducing a new game to, I don't know what you call it, public thinking, or a new phase or stage for public Discord or something like that. Um, I'm interested in your background intellectually. You're not an academic person, right?
Depends on what you mean by that.
Oh, that's right. That's right. You went to Harvard, right?
I went to Harvard Law School.
Law
Yeah,
school.
which is more like a, what'd you call it, well-branded vocational education.
Yeah.
But there's some theory there. I spent some time with Larry Lessig in particular, and with Roberto Ungar. And to
Ah,
be perfectly frank, after my 1L year, which is sort of mandatory legal stuff, I was pretty much no longer in the legal curriculum. I took this minimum number of classes in law school that I had to take, and I took like PhD level anthropology classes. I took classes over at MIT, the business school. My thesis was actually it ends up being, as it turns out, starting with Gilles Deleuze. It ends up actually coordinating with Greg Henrique's systems of justification. Right? So basically, I produced from a different place what he produced from his place. Um, yeah, so I think the way of describing is something like I went to college. I studied a bunch of different things. I
yeah,
think I started out with AI and economics. I think I ended up with philosophy and political
yeah,
science. Um, but I think I've always had very little attraction to the aridity and the and the, what's the right term for it? It's almost like the egoistic smallness that characterizes academia. Uh,
hmm,
kind of be a little harsh, but that's just my personal perspective on it. And
yes,
so I was like, "Fuck that! I'm gonna do the old school thing. I'm gonna make enough resources that I can just think the things I want to think with full,
right,
with no constraints."
right,
So basically, okay, I need fuck you money, and then I'm gonna go
yeah,
out and but do the thing. Like I've always been very interested. Even as a young kid, I was reading, philosophy in, I don't know, fifth or sixth grade.
mm,
Um, And so I think like a very good sort of very clean point
yeah,
was I was sitting in the lobby of Google in 2005, getting ready to go meet with Sergey because they were in the process of making an offer to buy the company that I had started and was the CEO of. And I had a copy of Difference and Repetition in my lap. And I
hmm,
was reading from that while waiting to go and have that conversation. I think that's probably the snapshot that tells the tale.
yeah. That's so funny. I think that's like a, without knowing those things, sort of like a scene I could imagine just with your character, or something that's like some sort of French post-structural reader in a, in a Google lobby. That's good. Roberta Unger. It's been a long time, but a lot of years ago I got really into him. That's really cool. There's that connection point, and that really makes sense when you say that.
Yeah.
And listening to you, I'm interested. What it within the at Harvard, was there any anthro people that you connected with? Or I'm not super familiar with the people.
I actually took a PhD class in anthropology, but just one. And I'm afraid I cannot remember the names of the two gentlemen. One of them was Indian,
Hmm.
and he was older gentleman then, like, early 70s.
Yeah.
And the other person I can't remember at all, so I apologize. I cannot give you names.
No, no worries.
Cornell West is not an anthro guy, but he was also a guy who I studied with.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Great. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. No, I'm kind of in that same or a similar place in terms of my kind of feelings about academia. I did undergraduate school at UCI and studied anthropology there, and was really already kind of going in was sort of reticent about what I could really hope for in an academic career or a job, and was really trying to go after a very sort of idealistic version of what could be possible on a university campus, or this sort of para-academic kind of work.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in the end, the nature of the economy, or the nature of the way in which work has to be done in the academy, just is totally non-conducive to the kind of work that needs to be done to actually help society, And so once you start to kind of, and it's really hard to see not kind of being in it, or not trying to do that thing, trying to figure out how to use the tools of some sort of academic infrastructure to create something that actually can shape society in some sort of way, And that was my big kind of hope, is to look at the humanities or anthropology and try to shift it a little bit towards something that was much more actively in the world and affecting the world, rather than simply interpreting it or simply receiving it or describing it. But seeing, I guess, this organic formulation of, people like you and John, and I guess intellectual dark web stuff in general has been really hopeful. I mean, even I wasn't even sure with intellectual dark web of where that was going to go, but I think seeing the stage, and I don't know if I would describe you and John and Greg and these different people as that same thing, but there's definitely a continuity in some ways, at least or at least not a direct relation, but
Kinship.
Yes. A certain, like, you're working off of the same momentum, or in the same space that's being opened up.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to say this, it's a little bit, it narrows, and these sorts of things shouldn't be narrowed. There's obviously an intrinsic complexity and richness to, well, everything important, but in this case, something like the IDW. And but one way of thinking about it is the folks who ended up being attracted to the IDW, in some sense, still feel some sort of value towards the legacy institutional form. Mm-hmm. Right? So they don't necessarily want things like, let's say, Harvard to go away. Mm-hmm. They just want Harvard to be renewed with, perhaps what its origin story proposes it to be. Right? Whether or not that's accurate, I don't know. But let's just assume that the basic sort of raison d'etre of the fundamental story of university is somewhat accurate. Yeah. To some extent, there's a group, a cohort, who are attracted to, can we renew that and re-engage that thing? And that maybe it's a little bit of what you were just saying. Hey, can we use this infrastructure and tools and history and lineage and practices of sort of university as guild, sitting next to other kinds of guilds, to do a particular kind of work out in the world, like as a guild, like applied.
Yeah.
And then, so I'm definitely coming from a very different perspective. Right. Even just in the story I told you, I'm coming from a perspective of, fuck that. The whole forum is actually guaranteed to get gummed up. And in the context of where we are now, where the rate of change has an intrinsic, the underlying BPM of, or what we can do the computational framework, the MIPS. What was it back in the Intel days? Remember, it was like a 486 was running at some kind of gigahertz, something like that. CPU clock cycles. since the CPU clock cycles are actually just going up in life, the time horizon where an institutional reset will actually have vitality, be like the thing that it says it is before it becomes corrupt,
Right.
is actually shorter.
Right.
Pardon me. So even if you were to renew the institutional framework, because the institutional framework has a characteristic of being a closed entropic system,
Yeah.
It'll go through sort of like childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood in, I don't know, 4 years, and then become
exactly.
sort of a decrepit zombie not shortly thereafter. So you haven't bought yourself much time. So I definitely come from that perspective, and I show up in that way. And then I think a key here is that I wouldn't say that Johnny V comes from that perspective. He's a full, full-time academic. Greg is also a full-time academic employed by universities. But I think they, to use kind of a Gen Z term, they vibe with that.
Right.
They're ready, willing, and able to be able to kind of like say and do things that would kind of get them frowned at in the academic watering cooler. Like, wait a minute, you can't.
Yeah. Well, there kind of seemed like two big anomalies in terms of like I look at the kind of work they're able to do and understand a lot of it has just been independently and sort of in spite of what the kind of workload they probably would have had to do for their academic jobs. And so it's always a surprise to me that they're even able to accomplish what they've been able to do, given the kind of specialization that's just required to be successful in that
it's pretty
realm.
Impressive. I mean, it's pretty amazing to think about like the kind of cosmopolitan and depth of their thought, and yet still having a real and sort of sharply pointed capacity in the context of their particular discipline.
Right. Yeah. And I'm curious with Zack Sign, I've kind of only just begun to kind of get into his work a little bit. But do you think his attitude about these visions of an educational reform, what's its relationship to the existing institutions? Maybe that's obvious if I were just to read closer, but do you know?
Yeah, I can say something about it. All right, so this is probably the most. Am I stealing anything from him? I don't think so. I think
it's okay. Steal.
No, definitely don't steal. Like it's almost like when you're playing music, you don't want to steal somebody else's piece. It's like, oh, that's his piece. He's going to hold it better. But I think this is fine. Right. He's been increasingly telling the story of a pretty legendary educator back in the period of the 17th century. I think that's right. 17th century is the 1600s. Yeah. Was that right? 20? Yeah. I might always get that wrong. So I can't remember his name right now. I think it's Ionitis, but I'm certainly wrong. I can't, the name doesn't stick in my head, which is probably a good sign that I'm not supposed to tell the story with too much ownership. But he's like this precursor to Spinoza and a precursor to the Rosicrucian movement and things like that. And, his shit was getting fucked up like crazy in their 30 Years' War.
Yes.
Like and so he's sitting there thinking about it. It's like, okay, civilization is falling apart. Like he's looking at it going, civilization is falling apart. This thing is the order that we've been operating under is completely broken.
Right.
And his insight was, okay, well, if we want to get out of this, the place from which we must start is a new approach to education. And so not new content, but new form.
Yeah.
And I would say that Zack is presenting a very similar proposition. So he is deeply critical of the form, and by the way, historically literate as to the specificity of how this form came to be what it is, and the implications of that form, and then has a model that sort of proposes what the design of an innovative form, and I mean that with a real focus not on the Silicon Valley sense of the term, but on the kind of the more root sense of the term, might be, and how that actually relates to the present moment, for example.
Yeah, definitely. I've just been thinking about, within certain philosophy, explorations, research work, whatever, a big focus for me has been thinking about designing an educational system and what would that really be like, with the intent of this understanding of the reason for the education system is it is the mechanism by which you shape society. If there's it's like, and when you really get into like the conceptual essence of what education is and what it is to what society is, it's you're just talking about the same thing, really. But I've kind of, especially when I was in the university, I was always going back and forth between two models. One was, okay, something that could fit within the institution and whatever, somehow funded in that way. Then the other, and the other one being just something that was totally non-institutionally based. And this becomes a bit more difficult, you know, whether it's, and now institution's a broad category, but, you know, so if you start thinking about an education system that is not part of a public university or private university, then either it's something sort of funded privately or something like that, which again is just kind of another private school. But eventually I got into this thinking of something closer to the like Paulo Freire critical pedagogy, where it has to be something that is for the poor, you know, for something that is optimized for people that don't have access to institutional funds or things like that. And that maybe not in its fullest sense or its fullest form, but in its most beginning part, like the basic things needed to assemble the game of this education system are super cheap or you know, free, so that anyone can start it and do it themselves. And that's kind of based in what should be the fundamental principle of education, which is autodidacticism, which is that however complex your relationship system or network gets, your interface with specialists and masters and things like that, and whatever disciplines you're doing, that the first principle is it's you. You are leading this, and it's up to you to formulate your version of this generalized system for yourself. And
so can I throw a couple of principles at that?
Please.
I mean, it feels like that seems like a very nice thing to talk about. I think it's timely, and I agree with the premise that it's you know, if it's not the base of the stack, it's only because conceptually when you get to the base of the stack, concepts actually fall apart too. But so it represents the base of the stack perfectly well. If you do that well, you've also done everything else necessary for the base of the stack to be done well. All right, so first principle is it's got kind of an odd variation on Gell-Mann amnesia. Are you familiar with that concept?
I don't think so. No, please.
So it's one of the most important concepts that nobody knows, and it's going to be funny. I'm doing a weird twist on it. In its most kind of parochial form, Murray Gell-Mann, a legendary physicist, and sort of mid-century and therefore erudite member of the Blue Church, and the way I describe it, is doing the thing that erudite members of the Blue Church do, which is flipping through the New York Times on a Sunday morning. And he's reading an article and like, very interesting. And he flips the page and reads an article, very interesting. He flips the page and happens upon an article that happens to be about physics, high energy physics. And he's just pissed. He's like, oh my God, this thing is just trash. It's wrong in terrible ways. To have read this makes me stupider, and anybody who reads it is likely to do harm, right? And he actually like is writing a letter, you know. Then he flips the page and reads a story about economics. He's like, oh wow, how wonderful and thoughtful. And then something's like, holy shit, wait a minute. Maybe this economics article, if I knew economics as well as I knew physics, was garbage, right? And he's like, that's an amazing thing that we have an amnesia. It's only in this very narrow band, particularly because we happen to be narrow band specialists in the contemporary educational domain, that we know enough to be able to know that the journalism is terrible. But because we basically apply authority to the form, we just forget it as soon as we turn the page, and we're sort of back into the amnesia. So, okay, now what I'm about to say doesn't make any sense at all. Maybe this is a terrible way of using the concept, but when you make the proposition that education is at the bottom of the stack, okay, and we're talking about trying to design an educational system, what you have to do is you have to recognize that means you actually have to go to the bottom of the stack. You can't import other elements of the stack that are higher level. For example, money, right? You can't say, okay, well, how do I fund education? Because funding imports things that are, in this by hypothesis, higher in the stack than education.
Right.
You literally have to do is say, okay, well, what's if I reboot the stack of the social infrastructure, right? Institutions. I recently had a video come out that making a distinction between community and society. So we're talking about society in that language.
Yeah.
The social institutions, the formal institutions, man-made, designed by people, systems of justification, all that kind of stuff, right? If we're saying, look, we're going to go to the bottom of that stack and we're going to reboot it down, what that means is basically what's below that. Well, what's below that is indigenous human. Yes. Right? Nothing else can be imported. Right? You have to actually be able to say, oh, I haven't got access to anything else but indigenous human.
Yes.
I don't even have houses, right?
Yeah.
I don't have agriculture. I got nothing. If I really, really want to go to the bottom of the stack, then I have to know that I have to have dropped all of civilization to the side. And I'm really starting out at the beginning. Well, okay, what are the things at the beginning? Well, at the beginning, so then when you move to the next piece, autodidacticism is in fact there at the beginning. Well, how do we know? Well, we know this. The only thing that you're really going to have for the rest of your life is you. Right? There are lots of relationships that will be meaningful, important. There will be places that you'll go, but the only thing that will truly be present all the time is you. Right? So that's the autodidactic loop. If you want to say, like, all effective choice making is governed by the degree to which the consequences of the choices ground out in the choice maker. The only person who can be truly responsible for you is you. Right? Now, of course, as an infant, so that's one. Right? So the next one is, okay, if I go back down to indigenous human, humans also have developmental arcs. Right? This is one of the things that Zach keeps hammering and say, hey guys, humans have developmental arcs. You have to really take that into account. It's part of the base code. Okay, well, clearly a newborn can't be wholly responsible for the newborn's complete life. However, a newborn is a magnificent autodidact.
Yes.
And they, in fact, are starting from not being able to focus on faces, right? They're learning all kinds of stuff.
Right.
So then there's context. Right? So if you look at a pedagogy, it is context, and then it's autodidacticism. Right? How does the context create a sort of an extended womb that maximally supports, flexibly, without constraining or controlling or shaping or shifting, the intrinsic autodidactic capacity that is in the individual? All right. So that's the base code of what education looks like, which is, by the way, now isomorphic with parenting and isomorphic with community. Right? So then what I would say is that essentially it comes down to this, that the most fundamental form of an educational institution is autodidactic self, and progressively increasingly, and now I use the term sovereignty to describe that. To be sovereign is both the state and the process of an ongoing upgrading in capacity to, first and foremost, increase sovereignty, and everything else kind of fits in that that rubric. Cross product friends. And now your parents show up as your first friends, hopefully, like ideally, but then as you get older and older, more and more friends will show up in your lives. And of course, to the degree which each one of them is increasing their sovereignty, then sovereign friends can collaborate with sovereign friends better. And what's really beautiful is that if you're sitting in a place of sovereignty, one of the things that is obvious, and I mean just like intuitively obvious as well as analytically provable, is that supporting the upgradient of the sovereignty of your friends is one of the best things that you can do for yourself.
Right.
We can go, ad nauseum about that. There's a whole universe about that as well, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think that's, super critical. And and I think for me, that's, these central themes that come out of, I think really all authentic philosophy, but more recently, or specifically German idealism and phenomenology, where you get this, the principle of the self, and the sort of dialectic sort of ends with the recognition of the self, like in Hegel, this developmental process of consciousness or whatever, as it matures, or through this process of suffering and going through life, in the spiritual inward journey, there's this recognition, higher and higher levels of recognition of the meaning of the self, and a greater awareness and identification with that person, because you start out with this attention towards objects, and eventually at some point you can and not a lot of people don't even make the first move, which is recognizing, okay, what am I? Okay, not just my body, but okay, this person that I am who has these likes, dislikes, this history, or whatever, this persona, ego, or whatever. And then there's the much, the more abstract thing of going deeper beyond that. What's the thing that constitutes that, and whatever. So, but then in Hegel, and so with Kant, that principle of autonomy, autonomos, of law or rule or order that comes from the self, is this principal word to describe sort of the essence of freedom. And but then that's brought into a deeper, and Kant may go there, I'm not sure, but definitely in Hegel.
By the way, you don't necessarily need to use names. It's actually, I think in my case, it's usually easier if you just describe the way that you yourself perceive it. If you need to reference the name to kind of import infrastructure to make it faster, please do. But it's actually smoother for me to be talking to you, not to Kant, because he's dead. Okay,
sure. Although I think it is important for whatever I think we're doing, or what people are doing, to frame what we're talking about, what we've come to understand for ourselves in that historical context for different reasons. But we can talk about that later. But so, yeah, this awareness of the self, but then part of that, the other element is the other, right? The experience of the not self, and that process, just as there's a deeper awareness of the depth of one's own self, the deeper awareness of the subjectivity and depth of the other, right? And only in that, this self-sovereignty or self-determination or power of the other, that you're able to now collaboratively, freely interact with and create, I think, exactly what you say, community, which is free individuals coming together and freely creating a higher unity, rather than that alien. So, see, there's the autos or the allos, which is opposite of self, other, but also allos, alien, or alter, or things like that, where one experience of alienation is as an it and as an object. And that experience, usually you're more likely to encounter the other as an it if you encounter yourself sort of as an it, right? Creates truly alienating kinds of actions / violent actions. Versus those that right. So that these are fundamental principles that are the basis of not only education, but politics and anything, and any sort of social.
And we can grasp it very early. Right. 2-year-olds are the perfect case study for this. Right. And what I mean by that is this. Okay, hold on. I was importing a lot of stuff as you were talking, so let me see if I can make it more explicit, because I don't want to be firing off a whole bunch of non sequiturs. All right. So what I was importing was things like, well, why does this alienation happen? Like, what's really going on there? And of course, I have a story about how it became pervasive. I call that game A. And a story about why it's difficult to get out of it. But the basic sense of it is this. If you're really just focusing on the short term, sometimes in fact instantaneous, narrow problem at hand, forcing somebody to do the thing is effective. Right? So if I got a 2-year-old and I want to go outside, and for whatever reason I think that wearing shoes is really important, and the 2-year-old is resisting putting shoes on, I can force the 2-year-old to wear those goddamn shoes. Right. And they will be wearing the shoes, and effective. Of course, the downside of that is I'm fucking them up. I'm getting in the kind of that autodidactic naturalness of how they go about actually making choices in the world, how they go about sensing what's right and what's wrong for them at the moment. By the way, trusting me, and what's the quality of our relationship, and how are we supporting each other? And they're two, right? So they're just pulling in whatever happens to be there, but I'm loading a lot of stuff into their developmental environment that is going to I'm fucking them up a little bit too hard, but it's going to make it harder. Right? I'm getting in the way of the smoothest path of their most robust development. I'm no longer supporting their sovereignty. I'm harming it.
Right.
So in the mid and long term, I'm creating noise, right? I'm creating entropy in the environment that I'm going to have to clean up, or they're going to have to clean up most likely in the future. And of course, if you do that over and over again, then you get into real trouble, because now you start having people where, Jordan Peterson, like, they can't and won't clean up their rooms unless there's some kind of formal social structure, which may be an authoritarian parent, that conditions them to do so. They're literally dependent on. They no longer are sovereign in the ability to actually make good choices in the context of their environment that are healthy for them, that for themselves, for nature, and for others. They actually have to be constrained. They have to be helped along by an institutional structure. And so, but again, I'm just going to import my model here. The problem is formal institutional structures are dead the moment they're born. Right? They cannot stay vital and alive and responsive to an evolving reality forever. Sometimes they may last 1,000 years. So that seems like a real long time to people. But if you're in the last 10 years of that 1,000 years, it's not very long, is it? And so, and as I said, in the context of now, where the clock speed is causing that rate, 1,000 years is not going to happen. Right? 10 years is 10 years is the time, maybe less. And so we're now kind of reaching the threshold where the trade-off of making short-term trade-offs to create, whether intending or not, making short-term trade-offs to generate effective results in the sort of immediate and narrow. And then the kind of, what would you call it? Kludge is the software term, kludging various kinds of extrinsic structures, rules, and incentive structures and things like that to keep things moving, decreasingly sovereign individuals, is reaching a terminus point, right? Where we're done. That story's over. And so we now have to, it's not just that it would be nice and good and humane and beautiful and wonderful and sort of poetic for us to reboot the educational stack down to the bottom and restart from the point of autodidactic individuals in friend relationship with increasingly sovereign people. It's actually sine qua non. Like that's what, that's the only path as far as I can tell to get us to the next level. Okay. Sorry.
And kind of piggybacking on that sentiment that I think I really appreciate hearing from you a lot, which is clarifying that the path of these certain social endeavors of liberation or bettering things or whatever, that it's so important to understand that if you compromise a principle like that, there's no way, so whether it's you're teaching your child or you're creating an education system, or you're thinking about a political project. The problem is because I also associate that principle of like allonomy or exterior, an external source of authority being fundamental to the state and any sort of institution. Usually there's a sense of, okay, how do we really define institution? But I think for now we can say, I think that really means some sort of social power structure associated with the state, either it's modeled by or directly correlating to it. The point is that whole apparatus, the central state and all the things related to it, all operate in that same principle. And once you are trying to come up with an alternative, it's so easy to sort of slip into that, but it's so important to sort of stay faithful to that. And in a sense, it actually makes it a little easier, even though there's a little bit of a hurdle at the beginning, but it makes it easier because the options of designing things, there's actually only kind of one way, if that makes sense. The one way is not in a particular one way, but the general way of understanding it is a one.
Yeah, I think so. So as a conceptual distinction, I think it was Carol Quigley that I learned this from, but I could be wrong. He makes a very nice distinction between what he calls an instrument and an institution.
I'm sorry, was he at Harvard like a while ago?
Georgetown, I think.
Georgetown. And what else did he write?
Well, the one that I most notably liked was The Evolution of Civilizations.
He writes something about Anglo-American.
The Anglo-American establishment. Tragedy and hope.
Just came across that.
He's a historian.
Yes.
He's awesome because he's like at the point when he was writing, like when he was doing his thing, he was a legitimate authority in the mid-century sense. Like he was a serious guy. He was teaching history at Georgetown, and the stuff he writes. If you read the Anglo-American establishment, it's conspiracy theory in the contemporary parlance, which is just to say, hey guys, guess what? Yes, there are conspiracies. It's been around forever. Of course, they're ubiquitous. And have you ever had a surprise birthday party for somebody? You participated in a conspiracy. The only question is, what scope can they manage, and how much of it is actually organic, bottoms up? You know, the conspiracy of traffic, for example, like millions of people are throwing metal around at 80 miles an hour and not crashing into each other. It's a conspiracy theory. But it's bottoms up, unconscious. And what fraction of it is top down and planned? And so how much scope, how much top down, how much bottoms up? That's the only real question. So in the case of a surprise birthday party, most of it is top down and the scope is small. Okay, cool. In the context of, say, organized crime, it's a really interesting combination of both, right? Playing on the underlying sort of game theoretic defection patterns and the corruption gradient of the local niche environment, and then some level of coordinated structure from the top to manage that conspiracy to do what it does. Fill in the blank. Sorry, that was a bit of an aside.
No. I think maybe by me showing my knowledge of that, I'm revealing my latest exploits in conspiracy research. But maybe we can talk about that later.
We can go down that rabbit hole. The premise of having fuck you money and choosing to think the way that my curiosity takes me is that subject to actually going batshit insane, unrecoverably batshit insane. It's even more intense than that. I've gone down some pretty deep rabbit holes and come back up and seem to still be able to make effective choices in the world. And that's that's the journey.
I'm always happy to hear others feeling that sense of comradeship of being rabbit hole wanderers. But anyways, please go.
All right. So back to instrument and institution. And Samo Berger, I think, is recapitulating a more robust language around the same kind of thing. Live players, dead players, that kind of stuff. But the basic sense is that an instrument is some kind of technology, which could include a shamanic ritual. It could include literature and writing, or it could include the DMV. That supports human agency in the world. But it's still fundamentally connected to complexity and therefore evolvability. An institution is, and I'm seeing just a simple curve that has a positive slope, a 0 point, then a negative slope. An institution is what happens when you get to the other side of that curve, where effectively the intrinsics of the instrument have detached from complexity and are no longer subject to evolvability at their most basic level. And so they begin the process of becoming effectively a thermodynamically closed system. There's some aspect of them that is not subject to change, that will hold itself constant, and try to constrain and control its environment, niche construction to maintain its beingness.
I think
there's a whole bunch of logic, by the way, that immediately happens as soon as that shift happens.
Right. And I think this is, I think what we're talking about applies to, like we said before, not only pedagogical system or some sort of political organization, but also I think what you guys have talked about the religion that's not a religion, of even when you're attempting to think about something that fulfills that hole that's there that needs to be sort of filled in that cultural space or whatever. How do you go about trying to create something new without going ahead and creating something that maybe even it takes 50 years or something for it to take that new form? But how do you really create that uncorruptible game, right? And that's what I'm really trying to work hard on, is how do you design the rules and the layout, the basic rules for a game that can change, that's open to change, but that the basic rules in the strongest way possible defend itself from deterioration into that kind of institutionalized form / into some sort of situation where you can have some group basically exploiting the game, or sorry, where you can have some players that are able to, that there is a route of play within the game that can result in the alienation of one player to another in some ways.
That's a nice way of putting it. Yeah, it's a very nice way of putting it. There's lots of ways of putting that moment, like that where you were conceptually, it breaks into lots of different ways of articulating it.
Right.
I was interested to see how it would surface for you, and it's a very nice way of putting it. So if I think about this, where we are, like the branching points on this, I want to bring one thing back in that takes us back about 15 minutes. Yeah. It feels to me like it's actually a really useful thing to bring in now in the context of where we just left off. I hope. We'll see. And this goes to, all right, so you remember I said earlier, if you're going to do the thing where you're going to the bottom of the stack, then you have to do away with the totality of all other social aspects. All institutions have to be deleted. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, if I'm starting with basic human, indigenous human, there's a whole bunch of stuff that shows up. Okay? People got to eat. Right? We gotta get water. We need to have some way of protecting ourselves against the hazards of the environment, such that the quality of our life is above some minimal threshold. And it's actually kind of interesting to say it exactly that way. And by the way, we both live in Southern California, so we are uniquely hothouse flowers in the context of what humans can actually deal with. I noticed that when I did my RV trip when I was in Vermont, and I was like, dude, it's fucking cold. And they're like, dude, it's 68 degrees. Yeah. It's going to get to 5 in a month.
Hold on. I need to turn my heater on.
I'm dying right now. But it's crucial, right? So if I say, hey, if I want to be able to support, if I want to create a context that supports this really powerful loop, it's a infinity loop. It's a Mobius strip between the self-sovereign, the autodidactic individual, and the relationality of friendship, so co-supporting sovereignty among a group. Well, I also have to be thinking about, in the context of just sovereignty, your human needs must be met. You must be fulfilled, to use a term that Joe Edelman and Tristan Harris coined for me 10 years ago. Max Neef style. Like, I don't know if you might very well know him quite well if your background is in anthropology. Max Neef. He's the guy who took like Maslow's hierarchy of needs and did like fundamental anthropology on it. He's like, okay, that's a cool idea. Let's take a look at it. So, okay, here's a list of 10 actual fundamental human needs that show up in every possible context.
Interesting.
And you can say that the
needs?
NEEF.
Okay, thank you.
And it's all the stuff. You got to eat, got to have water, got to have mating opportunities. You have to have opportunities for creative expression. You have to have a way of being connected to something that's larger than yourself. You got to have a place to live, like that kind of stuff. Yeah. It's like, look, every culture is in sort of a very fundamental way, just some set of interlocking, what he calls satisfiers, to satisfy human needs. And they're interlocking because the more synergistic your satisfiers, the more effective and potent your ability to satisfy needs is. Right? So a potluck dinner where you're getting socialization and food and possible mating opportunities and exposure to nature, like a potluck picnic, is more synergistic than drive-through restaurant, for example, which may in fact be, he calls it, has a great term for it. I think he calls it a I can't remember the exact term, but the idea is there's certain kinds of cultural satisfiers that are literally the opposite of what they present themselves as being, like a Coke. A Coke presents itself as being a refreshing beverage when in fact it's a toxic dehydrator. So it's like the worst case scenario.
What?
Sorry, bad news.
No.
And then on the opposite end of that spectrum would be a super synergistic satisfier, like a cool, clear running stream. Where you get cooled down, you can maybe get clean, you can fish in it, and you can drink the water. Like there's a bunch of things that comes from that. Why did I say that? Oh, well, back to the basic point. So, okay, if I'm going to create, what's my package? What's the payload? At the bottom of this game that I'm talking about, there's like 2 or 3 sort of fundamental design constraints. And you were just articulating the most, like the geometric design constraints at the level, geometric in the sense of being like, invariant under all transformations. That's what I mean when I say that term.
Like axiomatic, or like
axiomatic is the way to describe it. Yeah. Something that is so deep in the nature of reality that you can count on it is
Yeah.
not changing.
Yeah.
Um,
First principles.
First principles is another great way of putting it. Right? So you got some first principle stuff, as you said, like how do you design a game? How do you design a human system of justification, to use Greg's language, whereby the possibility of alienation of players is effectively zero, de minimis.
Right.
And we can do some other work on that front. Sort of design constraints. Another set of design constraints is, and that game must be centered around, and I'm going to propose this as an axiom. I can't, at this point, can't prove it as an axiom in the context that we have, but this pedagogical model, this Mobius strip that has the self-sovereign individual in on upgradient, synergistic sovereignty, friendship relationships with every other person is at the center of it. Right, that's the thing, like the generator function at the bottom of the game, and also from right now, like practically in medias res, human beings can get their needs met at a adequate level. And I'm going to say, and also in some sort of, how do I put this, like continuity of fulfillment. You know, so because if I give you, say, for the next year, you're going to get your needs met, but after that, everything goes to hell. Not a valid game, right? It will break apart. So there needs to be continuity of fulfillment across human needs. And at an adequate level. And by the way, because of the context that we live in, that's a really interesting turn. And actually, you know what? Let me double click on that, because I think we're really, really ripe to have this conversation. You know, if I talk about, let's just take a simple example of climate change.
Yeah.
So I'm going to propose that something within the notion of the concept of climate change is really real. I'm not going to want to argue about the specificity, but I'm going to say, look, here's the deal. Human beings have significant impact on the environment in which we live. There's a lot of us. And as we increase our technological capacity, the scope of that impact and the intensity of that impact increases. So as I multiply the lot of us by the magnitude of power that we have now, the ability of our underlying natural substrate to continue to regenerate its capacity to support us is breaking in lots of very important ways. Right? Pick your poison, whether you're talking about concentrations of estrogens turning the frogs gay, or you're talking about shifting in weather patterns that is breaking long-standing agricultural assumptions that are associated with populations. Or, by the way, you're talking about something like the geopolitical implications of Ethiopians trying to build hydroelectric dams that shuts off the water supply to Egypt, who are all going to die, right? You know, there's all kinds of interesting ways of slicing and dicing it. But the bottom line is shit's fucked up and it's going to get real bad real fast. Right? And that basic relationship between humans vis-a-vis each other and humans vis-a-vis nature is the concept. Okay. So that's what I mean when I say that phrase. Shoot, I went off on that to say, what was I saying before I went there?
Climate change was the start of.
All right, so the simple state is that that's true, right? That we're faced with some serious problems, and we're all going to have to make a lot of changes in how we live. Right? And for example, you're probably not going to be able to continue to drive your pickup truck the way that you do. Now, by the way,
how did you know?
Al Gore is not going to be able to fly his private jet neither. Right? And by the way, we now have a fundamental principle: symmetry. Right? It cannot be there cannot be an asymmetric distribution of responsibility in this particular story past some threshold. Right? Everybody's got to have their hand in at the same time and say, okay, I'm going to make these changes. But it's not all bad news. In fact, it's almost none of it's bad news, because here's the thing: right now we live, almost everybody, extraordinarily alienated from meaningfulness in life. So here's what you're going to trade. You're going to trade a lot of bullshit that's getting in the way of you living a meaningful life. And what you're going to get back is a deeply meaningful life. That's the real trade we're talking about. In the meantime, by the way, here's a cool ancillary benefit. We also solve all the problems of climate change.
Right.
And we solve all the problems of geopolitical conflict. Right? Isn't that neat? Like, I can literally trade you shitty, alienated, existential crisis, not spending time with your loved ones, not dying on your deathbed, surrounded by people who you care about and who care about you, going, that was a good fucking life.
A little less shiny metal, but much more beautiful.
Yeah, a little less shiny metal. That's funny. Who was I talking to about that? My daughter. It's funny. So my 18-year-old, like that awakening consciousness, she's like sitting there and she's like, Dad, money's not real. I'm like, okay, let's talk about that. And we were talking about, she's like, how did it come to the point where there was this concept where people had what they needed, and somebody else came along and said, hey, I'd like to give you some shiny metal you don't need in exchange for that thing that you got. And I'm like, and she's like, how'd that happen? I was like, well, it probably went like this. Shiny fucking metal, man. Look how shiny. Don't you want that? Oh, you can't have it. I got it. You can't have it.
Yeah.
Right? The mimetic desire, like the Gerardian.
Combined with a knife like this.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, whoa. And it was like, oh. And then as soon as one person's got it, one person's got it, and everybody else has got chickens, but one guy's got a shiny piece of metal. And like, I'm the only one who's got it. Everybody else is like, oh, got to have that, right? But there's only so much of it. And suddenly things go upside down, something like that. Obviously, that's kind of like a grade school narrative. But the point that you put, I think, is very nice, is a little less shiny metal and a little more, what was the phrase you said?
But much more beautiful or something like that.
Much more beautiful, much more beautiful, much more wholesome.
Right.
And by the way, this really neat ancillary benefit that it will actually continue.
Right.
So your children and your grandchildren will also be able to live a real, healthy, meaningful life. Like if you're not signing up for that, then you are in fact my enemy. Like that's
which I think you and I can because we've actively been probably thinking about it, it can kind of imagine and put it into view. But even for myself, still something so difficult to really imagine is that kind of world, because of how quickly we or how deep the environment and flavor of life really seeps into us all, so.
Oh God, we're all incredibly addicted. Like we are, we need the biggest AA meeting of all time.
Right.
Hi, my name is Jordan. I'm addicted to all kinds of shit.
Yes. I'm addicted to,
like I'm addicted to sitting in chairs, I'm addicted to air conditioning. I'm really addicted to my phone. Like it's brutal.
Addicted to clothes. Damn those clothes.
All right, so that's one. That's big. That's a big problem. But here's a deeper one. All right, you ready? So this is going to be my riff in the direction of the feminine and the masculine. I was talking to my wife about this a lot. Like she's amazing, and she's done an enormous amount of work of actually really doing what we would call here in Insignias, embodying the feminine. And how did it work? So it was something like, this call. All right. So I have actually a lot of conversations with people one-on-one. Mm-hmm. And it's roughly half and half, men and women. Mm-hmm. But none of the women are willing to permit it to be recorded. Mm-hmm. And some of the men are, like in this one. This is going to be recorded, and I hope that at the end we'll publish it. I think there's a value in this being shared. And of course, I'm going to honor that. Right. And by the way, if you said, hey, I don't want this published, then it won't be published.
Yeah.
But none of the women want it published. And she said something really, unfortunately, she said it so well that I don't even want to, I don't want to dishonor it by saying it poorly, but it was more or less along the lines of course, right? This is something that doesn't want or need to be poked and prodded at by other people's attention. There's something about the sacredness of it that actually needs to be held with care and closeness, something like that. Like that's not right, but it's sort of gesturing in the direction. You'd have to ask her to get the exact right words.
I'll ask her.
But how's this work? All right, so let's take a couple. I'm going to pick a bunch of swings at this because I think it's super important. All right, so one swing. You ever read the poem Ozymandias by Percy Shelley?
Just bits. No,
all right. Well, it's not very long, so I recommend reading it right now. It's just short. The gist of it is this: classic Indiana Jones style guys like walking across the desert, comes across two objects just sitting in otherwise just wasteland sand. Mm-hmm. One is this face, like a giant head of a statue, clearly that had fallen long ago, that has like a kingly aspect to it. And the other is the pedestal with 2 feet and some words, and presumably in a language long lost, but he happens to be able to translate. Mm-hmm. And the plaque says something like, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, behold the glory of my kingdom and despair. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And of course, the point is it all turns to sand, right? It all turns to dust. All kingdoms will return to dust. Right? Okay. Now hold that. All right. 2. I'm going to do this in a really kind of a poetic way. So I'm going to loop around. I want it to land it in an odd way. All right. So 2 is, with the invention of writing, certain characteristics of humanity were upregulated, other characteristics were downregulated. Those characteristics that could be transmitted via dead text, like accounting, suddenly had this characteristic of outliving their moment by a long time. Right? You could actually read a text that was written about a story, for example, a story of Osiris 500 years ago. Right? It sort of has this new shift. Specifically, it has a characteristic of being somehow transcending human life. It transcends life and death. It has an immortality aspect to it.
Yeah.
And those characteristics that aren't that kind of thing, like a woman's experience of childbirth, very, very difficult to convey, particularly in hieroglyphs, don't have that same upregulation. Right? So I would propose that one big piece of the historical shift of the relationality between the masculine and the feminine, and by the way, the male and the female, and the men and women, which aren't exactly the same,
right.
Was in fact the introduction of writing. Right? And you'll notice, I don't know if you know, but the historically, almost always it was the case that the earliest literate were boys, and usually trained quite painfully. And of course, the content of most early writing were things like formal laws, contracts and agreements, and accounting ledgers. Okay, and then the stories of the royal family. This person did this to that. Like those kinds of things are early content of writing.
Yeah.
Okay. Next piece. Part of this gives rise to the sense of or yearning for what I would call immortality, which is funny because it ain't immortality. It's just living longer than you happen to live. And so I'm familiar with the notion that Julius Caesar lived. Yeah. And so from the point of view of my own very brief existence on this planet, part of my egoic self in particular has oh man, I would like to be as well known as Julius Caesar. Wouldn't it be amazing if people 1,000 years from now or 2,000 years from now knew my name? And to the degree to which, by the way, you are saturated in history, you're saturated in the things that can be transmitted via writing, via non-imminent in the Forrest Landry sense, not right here, right now relationality, but can in fact be artifacted into some substrate that carries on for a long period of time. You may have a sense of being able to live past your own death. And so to the degree to which you have a fear of death, then you will have an attraction towards this artifact of immortality, right? Which then makes you want to be famous, right? Because the only way to really have immortality is to be famous, right? You want your name and identity. Your identity can become famous, not yourself. Your rich, nuanced reality of who you are in your deepest sense cannot be captured by the mediated artifacting of writing or whatever else, right? As we all know, even a really, really good biography is a minuscule snapshot of the reality of the life of the person, minuscule, infinitesimal. But some aspect of your identity can be rendered somewhat immortal, right? But of course, Ozymandias, right? Whatever immortality you have is subtended on the civilization infrastructure that is carrying that story forward, and that will also end, right? There is no infinite year Reich to which you can become the great leader and therefore have your name carried forward with it. And by the way, that is exactly the energy right there. Like that imperial energy is the energy of immortality of that sort.
Yes, yes.
So now I return back to my wife. I return back to my interlocutors who say, what I'm talking about is a little bit too subtle. It's a little bit too nuanced. It's too needs more care than is appropriate being broadcast out to the attention of the world.
Yeah.
And said, you know what? That's probably the healthiest possible way to be. Remember that phrase, like well-behaved women rarely make history? What I would propose is that the right answer to that phrase is, and that's a really good fucking thing. Because yearning to make history is the building blocks of tyranny.
Yes. Yeah.
Live a meaningful life, die with an absolute certainty that the only recollection of your having existed at all will be carried by your friends and family, right? And when they die, it will fade, it will fade, it will fade, right? Live so that other people after you can live, but do not endeavor even an iota to carry more of the future to yourself, actually embodied in the livingness of those who continue to live past you.
Yes.
That is a demoralizing blow to the egoic structures that dominate the current reality. that's probably the most painful pill that I would propose as part of the transition that I've been proposing.
Yeah. Let me try to put something on that. Yeah, I think that's super critical. But I think, it's something that I struggled with a lot, this attempt to be concerned. It's something that is already there when you have this concern for the future of humanity. And if your mind is there a lot, because what you're thinking about is how can I do something that has an effect on that future? And so there's this tension between the self-questioning, am I doing this for those egoic reasons so that I can leave my mark, so that you can know my name, my face, my handprint. And I think that's always a danger, and we always must be watchful for that. On the other hand, I'm not, and I don't think you are, and I think most of us are not, ready to let go of this. Well, we still want to have that effect, whether it's as minimal as let's make sure we don't leave a mess for the next generation, or as more developed as let's leave a garden for them in some sort of way, in many different ways. So the task, and this becomes more difficult when we get into the realms of ideas and words, and us as word makers, and idea, same thing. And how do we create the conceptual or linguistic technology that will be needed for the future of humanity in a way that doesn't tie it to an individual?
All right, that was an interesting thing to throw in there. Intense.
And I think for us that becomes a task of for me still being committed to that construction project, design project, but trying to figure out how to build that game in a way that's either anonymous or made anonymous through the ecstatic convergence of multiple voices, right?
Yeah. Nice.
So that we can show our faces, and because I think there's some downsides to the anonymity part.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
But by getting enough of us together, we can create a product that doesn't belong to any of us, right?
Yeah, great. Holy smokes! Let's see. No, this is you reached the point where that I was wanting to bring back in. So,
and the masculine and feminine maintain their balance.
So you've got a story where, on the one hand, there's the way of endeavoring to the way of how do people go about making choices such that they are trying to make the world a better place. Let's just make that, I'll say it like in a simple way. Okay? And it does seem like there's basically two paths, going back to our 2-year-old. Right? There's the path of the exterior, the path of the, what was the phrase? It was the opposite of autonomic.
Allonomic?
Yeah, allonomic, right? So there's the allonomic path and there's the autonomic path. The autonomic path is the one that you just ended with, I think. Like there's a perfect continuity there. Right? If I follow the autonomic path, one of the things that I notice is that I am also connected with things that are much larger than me, of which could be this multiplicity. In fact, is this multiplicity and all the multiplicities. And if I simply do, that's such a funny thing to say, if I simply do what is right, then I will intrinsically support the ongoingness, the health and the nutrition of the world in which I live. Now, of course, simply doing what is right that ain't simple. but if other people in the past have said things like natural law, right? And that has a weird feel, I think, in many cases, but it's a little bit like, if I drop a rock, it falls is natural law, but there's a lot more to it, right? There's to use the term that I used, the way I used it earlier, there are characteristics of the nature of reality that if I hew to those characteristic natures of reality, and I notice, for example, this just is a simple one. You and I, have this very interesting shared characteristic, which is that we are the heirs to something along the lines of like billions of years of phenomena that have as a primary characteristic a ongoingness in reality. We're going back just a step, right?
Yes.
You're a child of your parents, and your parents are a child of and you go back to like pre-humans, you go back biological evolution. And I think you can go back even further than biological evolution, but certainly biological evolution. And in the process, there's been a lot of learning about what kinds of things tend to orient towards the ongoingness and what kinds of things tend not to orient towards ongoingness. And so there's something, the wisdom of that is a very powerful substrate. This, by the way, is another way of saying relevance realization. And when John V says relevance realization, he's saying, hey, use the wisdom of many billions of years of not fucking everything up to guide you in making choices that are effective. And also, by the way, consciousness, right? What we're doing right now is the edge, right? It's the kind of like the nib of the pen on the paper is, hey, and we are unique in that lineage and having this particular capacity to perceive reality, to think about reality, to communicate with other things that can perceive and think about reality, and to generate something that is sort of new in the world and has even more capacity. And of course, even more capacity to fuck things up. So, okay, we got to be careful about that. And there's something about the, how do we form that multiplicity that you were describing earlier? Like just that, how do we actually form that, where that felt sense of alienation, or the felt sense of defection, which are mirror images of each other, don't happen. And for us to form the multiplicity where we all are actually not just comfortable in our own anonymity, but also, in fact, actually, what are the conditions that give rise to that multiplicity in the first place? I've called this variously over time, effective collective intelligence, coherent collective intelligence, coherence in and of itself, the Holy Spirit, right? There's lots of different names for that. I like that one too. It has a nice like ring to it. But what are the characteristics that consistently and with integrity give rise to the Spirit, such that it is the Spirit that is creating the thing? And we are merely the vessels and agents and instruments of it. Not the institutions, but the instruments of it, even in ourselves. In that context, if we learn how to do that and we say, okay, that's just the nature of how reality works, we're just doing the thing that it does. One, I would propose analytically, I can prove, this is nice for the ego. Hey, ego, by the way, I can analytically prove that's the way we get out of the trouble that we're in. That's the mechanism whereby we collectively develop the capacity to generate enough collective sovereignty that can respond to the context that we're in, such that we can not kill everything and we can live in peace together ongoingly. And also it has all the design characteristics that we're talking about. And there will be no alienation in that space. There will be no defection in that space. It's a very specific location in what Greg would call culture space or systems of justification space.
And ultimately, it's something that, even though it's a principle that could be given words to, the embodiment of it is something that is a bit harder to grasp, and something that can only really be sort of put into being by being around it. It's like, it's like with martial arts. I do martial arts, and there's certain things that, you could, a really intelligent person could get manuals and try to put it back together. And I think that there's an important thing about that. But to really light up a group of people, to allow them to plug into some sort of stronger energy, it has to be through that sort of embodied relationship, I think. And I mean, even this disconnected virtual experience too, where it's sort of like a rhythm of openness or freedom, where it's not, I'm trying to distinguish it from something that's more procedural, even though it has certain characteristics that are almost like that. But it's not based in singular actions at all, right? It's the context of acting at all. So that's why this sort of what I call like an autologicalness, where the self is you're acting from that centeredness, right? Or there's that connection to the self or connection to spirit or divine or whatever. It has to be there, you know, it has to already be there for us to dip ourselves into it or to allow other people to dip into it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's maybe even the deepest point in the stack. You know, so certainly something that I've learned and have endeavored to do with greater or lesser degrees of success is to have as a fundamental principle, if connected to the infinite, then do more stuff. If not, then stop and go back.
Exactly.
Like that's like a very straightforward rule.
Exactly. I mean, and that becomes for me, you know, I really try to connect these philosophical or psychological principles with practical activities, martial arts, music, things like that. And it's the same as like, once you get more and more acquainted with that state of integration or self-consciousness or whatever we might call it, not like you know, ego, like, oh, how are people seeing me kind of consciousness, but then it's exactly that. It's all right, hold on, don't do anything. You're not there. And if you're not there, your notes are not going to sound nice. So hold on, wait for that fog to wash over, and then let it unfold. Right?
Yeah. So okay. So can we have a little bit of time left, I think. Yeah, about 15 minutes.
Okay.
And so what I'd like to do is maybe loop things all the way back to some of the earlier notions. So education, child development, human development, parenting, community, and in medias res, where we are. So the phrase would be something like, we got a lot of healing to do. Lots and lots. Nature, regeneration of nature, trauma healing, relationship healing. We got a lot.
Yeah.
And if you take the rule that you just put in place, is make it like a fundamental rule, then most people aren't going to be doing a whole lot. Right? I can't do a whole lot. I can tell you that. And if I use that as a rule, I can't do most things in my life from a place of really being grounded and connected to the whole thing all the time. I've had maybe periods of time when supported by other people who are better at it than myself, and very pulled out of this context, right? No cell phones, no coffee, maybe for a week or two, which is actually pretty impressive. Like a week or two of actually having a sacred relationship to life and myself and others in continuity. Yeah. But if we're going to try to build up to that, we've got a lot of healing to do. Right. Good. Fair enough. That's okay. But if we work backwards, so here's the basic situation. We're going to need to figure out a way to take care of each other. Mm-hmm. And we're going to make sure that everybody is okay. Right? That doesn't mean living the high life. Private jets going to go down. Right? Wagyu beef going to be a lot less. We're going to have to step away from a lot of that stuff. And a lot of work, like a lot of people actually doing that and realizing that for many of us, it's going to be a life journey that's not going to end with completion. Right. My personal life arc is characterized by a truly enormous amount of poor attachment. Yeah. And the sort of the synergistic status or the synergistic link of trauma-related defense mechanisms that pull me out of relationality. Yeah. And by the way, a neurophysiology that's super, super sensitive, like really good at perceiving subtle things, but therefore as a consequence, if it gets out of whack, it may actually take a while. Like if I actually get something hits me, it can take days or weeks for me to literally at a physiological level, get back to the point where I can come back online, to use that language. Yeah. And in that entire time frame, I tend to just withdraw. Right? Well, that's it. I know that was done a long time ago. Right. And I know for sure that as a parent of two teenagers, I delivered my fair share of poor parenting and trauma to them, and even more so that the psychopathic civilization that I have entrusted them to, and that they are stepping into, is going to continue to grind them in its gears as it does. Right? That's that. Right? That's just straight up reality. That's where we are, right? And that's for like affluent white folks in America in 2021. Obviously, there's folks all over the world who have a differential set of challenges that they're facing, and they're all rough, right? It's going to be rough. It's going to be rough for us to figure out how to do this healing collectively. All right, that's it. That's the reality. Right? All lives are sacred. the world itself can be related to as sacred.
Yeah.
We're each going to have to figure out how to move step by step. There's not going to be a lot of teleporting. Right? Getting from where you are to the next step is a stepwise basis. But can we begin the process of all recognizing, okay, I don't know how I'm like, I don't know, this is a lesson that I learned many years ago. There's two really important pieces to it. It has to do with this notion of relationships and sovereignty. Right? One is everybody's got their own cross to bear. Right? It's actually wrong for me to take your burdens from you if they are in fact your burdens to bear. Right? Your own life and your development is part of your story, and my ability to discern, like, am I truly furthering your development by supporting you in this way, is super non-trivial. Right? It's not obvious what is the right choice to make with regard to somebody else who is suffering. Right? That's one piece. The other piece is the classic kind of lifeguard problem. If there's a drowning man out in the water and I swim out to him and I don't know what I'm about, now there's two drowning men out in the water, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't help anybody. How do we actually really effectively, like, I'm really like this, we have to be really serious. It's not hand wavery. It's not, empathy ain't enough, right? We actually have to say, okay, I truly hold all lives as sacred in the most fundamental sense, and recognize that being able to be in relationship with the whole of humanity and the whole of nature in that way is super non-trivial. And the world is littered with well-intentioned catastrophes. So can we step away from evil? Right. Can we also not make our choice stepping into well-intentioned catastrophes, but find that very fine line of what is a path that will actually migrate us to a point where somewhere down the road, we've actually gotten there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's important not to make an idol out of that high ideal of being in tune with that thing or whatever we want to, however we want to talk about it, where it's an ideal and it's almost like a point where we'll never reach it. We can always kind of infinitely approach it, right? But always, especially for ourselves and for other people, to give a tremendous amount of grace, right? And to allow that. And because that's necessary for action, right? To start getting things rolling, you have to have, it's necessary to have that first principle or that ideal, but also the knowledge that it's going to be totally imperfect, right?
Yeah.
But I think, so many more things I want to talk to you about. I think sharing ideas about how I've tried to sort of formulate something that I think would be parallel or similar to like your Civium project or pedagogical project. To me, it's, all the sort of same thing. And
very much
I kind of call it, I have this idea of calling it anthropology, and it doesn't make sense, and that it requires an explanation, right? But I see, I don't want to be sort of ideologically colonial towards you, right, in a sense, or to place names on you, but I see what you do as being an exemplar of what I see anthropology to be in a certain way, which is not, part of it is, it's not ethnology, which is what it kind of means a lot of times. It's not just a study of the empirical study of culture. But for me, if you go back and study the origin of it, it's the holistic study of humanity. And I think I would also just describe you as a philosopher. But on top of that, I think compared to other people specifically is this attention to the generalized ontology of the human as being essential to understanding a civilization design, a pedagogical design, religious design, whatever you want to call it, as those provide the basic first, now a system of first principles of the human experience that are sort of grounded in the first person experience, but then extend to this practical realm, these realms of practical affairs, whether it's the ecological, right, the most material, then within that, the social, the inner subjective, whatever, and then within that, the sort of linguistic, intellectual sort of stuff. But hopefully one time we can try to play with that, because that gets into the details of if we're using the game language again, which is interesting. I was using it kind of by myself or whatever, then you and a lot of other people just I think it's really natural to it. But this game of what I call this process of anthropoiesis, the cultivation and perfection and creation of humanity, and then you can add the auto-anthropoiesis, that we do this ourselves, right? It's not an alien creating us, as a thing, but the anthropological perspective allows us to see ourselves and to look at ourselves as a whole, as a society in the past and the future, and then to integrate ourselves within this larger project, which is this anthropoietic process of not only shaping, but shaping towards its ideal form. This is the riddle within even the idea of anthropos, which is it something, or is it something to be? Is it an ideal? There's a long history in humanism where it's both, whether it's humanitas or anthropos or whatever, of that word being used not only as a descriptor of what we are, but in some more important sense, ethical ideal of what we could be, almost like an Übermensch, but it's just like to be humane, to be human is we're always tied to that ideal potential, right? Which is not only for us, but ultimately true for all things, right? That there's this tractor beam or whatever pulling us towards a higher and higher form of what we are, or something like that. But I don't know if you have to go right now.
I do. I gotta go.
All right.
All right. Nice. Very nice to meet you.
All right. Nice to meet you too. Hopefully we can schedule something else.
Yep. Yeah, we will definitely be able to find time in the future.
All right. Thanks, Jordan.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.